Okay, so for this first screencast video lecture on feminism, I decided to go through my notes from previous semesters and read out some examples of what we could refer to as patriarchal ideology. Now, I do want to say that if you recall from the unit on Marxism or Marxist theory, uh, Marx's uh, understanding of the term ideology is this: it refers to the sentiments, beliefs, ideas, and ideals, which is to say the general culture of the the bourgeoisie, or what he sometimes refers to as the ruling class or the dominant class. And for Marx, ideology uniquely is a system of ideas that is generated by capitalist societies or the capitalist economic system. But also, for our purposes, it's helpful to understand that capitalist ideology or bourgeois ideology crucially draws from ideas that are generated by the past in Western civilization in particular. And so, starting off with Aristotle, Greek philosopher and scientist, who was born in 384 BC, died in 322 BC, before Christ was born. He says in his book or his treatise, The Politics, that it is clear that it is both natural, which is to say good or just, and expedient or advantageous for the body to be ruled by the soul, and for the emotional part of our natures to be ruled by the mind, the part which possesses reason. The reverse, or even parity, would be fatal all around, right? So he is part of this tradition of binary thinking that opposes reason or the mind to the body, which is associated with the emotions, the realm of instinct, appetite, desire, what have you. Uh, and he says that if emotions, the passions, were to get the upper hand over reason, then civilization as he knows it and understands it, society as he knows it, understands it, and values it, would not be possible. Everything would fall into chaos and disarray. And he says this is also true as between man and other animals. For tame animals are by nature better than wild, he asserts, and it's better for them all to be ruled by men because it secures their safety. Again, as between male and female, the former is by nature superior and ruler. Of course, he's talking about men. The latter, he's talking about women, he asserts, inferior and subject. And this must hold good of mankind in general, or we would refer to as humankind in general. Less patriarchal language, the one that Aristotle had at his disposal, and the language that also informs his thinking on the supposed essential or fundamental differences between men and women. Notice that this tradition of thinking about the differences between men and women uh, reasserts itself as it were, the kind of a vengeance in the figure of Cato the Elder, Roman senator and historian, uh, born 234 BC, died 149 BC. He asserts that woman is a violent and uncontrolled animal. Why? Because the assumption is that women are somehow closer to nature, right? Uh, More subject to their emotions, passions, appetites, instincts, like animals supposedly are, and that men are in possession of this thing called reason that allows them to discipline, domesticate, civilize, control the passions, the emotions, appetite, instinct, the so-called lower half of human nature. St. Thomas Aquinas, Italian priest, philosopher, and theologian, uh, born 1225, died 1274. Some of you may be familiar with Thomas Aquinas. You know that there's a college, a liberal arts college, named after Thomas Aquinas here in Grand Rapids, Aquinas College. And he says this: a necessary object, woman, who is needed to preserve the species or to provide food or drink. So a woman is necessary insofar as the human species propagates itself through a woman's body, right? Uh, and a woman's purpose or her natural sort of role is to provide food and drink to men, to take care of children, and so on and so forth. Jonathan Swift. Many of you may be familiar with Jonathan Swift from having read A Modest Proposal in high school, or maybe you've read Gulliver's Travels. Brilliant mind, but a mind nevertheless limited by the time, the culture, the place that he lived, right? Limited by patriarchal ideology. And this is not one of Swift's best moments. And somebody who is, widely regarded, and who I regard, um, you know, as a deeply humane thinker, but nevertheless a person whose thinking was, again, flawed, limited by patriarchal ideology, the time, the place, the culture that he lived in. He says, "I cannot conceive of you to be human creatures, but a sort of species hardly a degree above a monkey." I take it you're noticing a pattern here. Edmund Burke, Anglo-Irish statesman, political theorist, philosopher, born 1729, died 1797. A great Enlightenment thinker, and indeed another very humane thinker, but is nevertheless subject to these really sexist and not altogether sophisticated thoughts on the nature of women. He says a woman is but an animal, and an animal not of the highest order. Another Enlightenment thinker, philosopher, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, a supremely influential thinker and philosopher of the Enlightenment, who has this to say about women. He says women are certainly capable of learning, but he says they are not made for the higher forms of science, such as philosophy and certain forms of creativity. It's a shame you didn't have the opportunity to read the work of Emily Dickinson. But then again, Emily Dickinson didn't live during his time, and even if they did live during the same time, Emily Dickinson, for complex reasons, decided not to publish her poetry. Right? She lived in this very patriarchal and indeed an oppressively patriarchal culture that generally thought that women were not capable of, thinking particularly profound, deep, or rational or logical thoughts, and were not capable of producing uh, works of the creative imagination, which is to say, works of art. Uh, Thomas More, Irish poet, singer, songwriter, and entertainer, lived 1779 to 1852. He says, "However, man rules in science and art, the sphere of women's glories is the heart." Kind of a backhanded compliment, but you imagine during the time this would have some, women sort of gushing with enthusiasm for the beauty of Thomas More's poetry, his lyrics. And again, there's this notion that men are eminently reasonable, and women are inherently or naturally, as it were, emotional beings or creatures. Another instance or example of patriarchal thinking, patriarchal ideology. And then finally, last thinker, uh, Sigmund Freud. Will be familiar with him from the unit on psychoanalytic theory, Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis. Born in the 19th century, died towards the middle of the 20th century, just before the outbreak of World War II. And he says in Civilization and Its Discontents that women represent the interests of family and sexual life, which is to say, reproductive life. The work of civilization has become more and more men's business. So, a pretty consistent pattern of thinking holds true over the past 2,000 years, more or less. Okay? So, this is a very, very long and esteemed tradition of thinking that posits that there are some essential differences between men and women, and they're grounded in nature or biology. And all of these thinkers would be examples of what Lois Tyson refers to as phallogocentric thinking. I'll just read off from Tyson real quick. Quote, all of Western or Anglo-European civilization is deeply rooted in patriarchal ideology, which is to say, phallogocentric thinking that is male-oriented in its vocabulary, rules of logic, and criteria for what is considered objective knowledge. And phallogocentric thinking is structured by what Tyson refers to as binary oppositions. We'll learn more about binary oppositions in the unit on deconstruction. And binary oppositions structure patriarchal ideology, which is to say, a system of thought or thinking that assumes there are certain innate differences between men and women. And I just want to go through some of these binary oppositions that structure patriarchal ideology. It considered examples of the way that phallogocentric thinking is generally structured along these lines. So, human, animal, good, evil, masculine, feminine, civilized, primitive, culture, and nature. And if you look vertically, you see how that all these terms, and you look back at the examples that I gave you of patriarchal ideology, uh, they map onto each other. Human is identified with the good, with reason, with masculinity or maleness, which is associated with civilization and culture. And then on the other side, the opposite side of the privileged set of terms, we have the opposite of the human, which is to say, the animal, the opposite of good, evil, emotion, feminine, primitive, nature. And notice how all of these terms, you look down vertically, tend to map onto each other and altogether comprise a total system of thought uh, that you know, that amounts to a system of ideas or a way of thinking that assumes that there are fundamental, innate, or essential differences between men and women, right? And it's a system of thought or the system of ideas called patriarchal ideology that the unit on feminism examines. And you think about feminism as a philosophy, as a way of doing politics, as a way of thinking. It very powerfully works to deconstruct, to call into question, to complicate uh, this system of ideas and help us to be able to think more objectively about, you know, the so-called differences between men and women. So more on feminism as a philosophy, a way of doing politics, a way of thinking, as a way of life, um, in the subsequent screencast video lectures, starting with the first concept from the unit on feminism, feminist criticism.